Welcome back to the show. We know there's been a lot of news out of Washington, D.C. over the past week, and we want to talk about it. My Hot Topics panel of Omari, Justin, and Joseph are back. From Roe versus Wade to new gun laws to separation of church and state, it's been a lot of change. Now, Roe versus Wade overturned, but new gun laws also signed into law. Can we work together? Does this give us a little bit of hope that as a country, as state, we can find some common ground? What do you think?
I have to say, I did not think the gun legislation was ever going to happen. So the fact that they were able to come to a compromise on that in both the House and the Senate, I was so just pleasantly surprised by that. And it gave me some hope for possibly more working together in the future.
Yeah. What about you two?
I'm so glad I cover neighborhood news. I feel like my neighborhood's still working things out. It's good to hear folks who find hope in both of those elements, gun control and of course the hope in the issues around abortion. I think it's a bigger leap for a lot of people. We saw a lot of presence of anger during Pride celebrations this weekend. Despite all the fun and joy in the streets, there was a lot of anger and people who are looking to put up a fight about this situation and make things right.
Definitely.
So, I think it's too early for that issue, especially in my neighborhood.
Yeah, Omari, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, with the gun issue, it's still going to come down to enforcement. There's so many laws that are on the books, federal laws and everything else. These guys, I mean, we don't value life enough. Right, when you talk about this gun issue here, and so I mean, although it seems a bit performative out of D.C. to be honest with you, but they did do something. And then on the issue of Roe versus Wade, I just think that, I mean, people need to make a commitment to uplift life throughout life. You know what I'm saying? And we'll see how this goes, but I mean, that's kind of how I feel. Is it, people live a long time. And what's our commitment to uplifting people in our society?
Justin, you mentioned anger, and there is a lot of anger, but I sometimes think we run away from that, and maybe anger isn't such a bad thing as long as then we can channel that and work together, because sometimes it takes that and then we channel it. So I am hopeful as well. Choppa was happening 2 years ago on Capitol Hill, and Omari and Justin, you both did quite a bit of reporting.
Yeah.
Where are we now as far as how are you feeling about that?
Well, I wanted us to talk about this because it was such an interesting time for our city, and I was living right in the middle of Capitol Hill back then, right across from the police station. I took this picture from my apartment window, and it was just a really interesting time. But shout out to Justin and Omari, because I got so much from their tweeting and their coverage during this time. When the first time that the police chose to use the tear gas, I had no idea that was going to happen. And of course, it's summer, we're all hot, no one has air conditioning, the windows were open. And I think I saw a retweet from someone saying they're starting to use the tear gas. And that is when I immediately ran and shut my window, because that would have immediately gone into my home, since I lived literally across the street from the police station. So, Omari did say, some of these photos, they can be triggering, we realize that, but it's important to not forget all that happened during that time, I think. Yeah.
Omari, you said looking back, sometimes you don't want to look at the pictures.
Well, no, I mean, it was a traumatizing time there. And if I got a minute here, I mean, we can't talk about the Seattle protests first without mentioning the names: Lorenzo Anderson Jr., Antonio Mays Jr., Summer Taylor. You know what I'm saying? I mean, these are all people who lost their lives during the Seattle protests. And also, people should remember, we talk about Choppa. Before Choppa, there was the Western Barricade. It was 7 days there, right there on 11th.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Where Seattle saw the biggest display of police violence against its citizens ever. And when you just mentioned the tear gas, people need to remember, protesters were not tear gas. One of the most highly densely populated neighborhoods in Seattle that had protesters in it was tear gassed, right?
Yep.
Again and again and again. People who live in the neighborhood hit by projectile. I mean, it was massive police violence.
Right.
It was. 2 years later, when you ask me what's changed, unfortunately, nothing. It was very performative. I think at the time, people were like, oh, let's do this, let's invest, let's put money and everything else. 2 years later, though, You know, the winds have changed. And the last thing I'll say, is the same three issues that existed in the black community before the murder of George Floyd, which is the income gap here in Seattle. Black households make $42,500 a year, white households $105,000. The gap still remains. You know, there's the home ownership is constantly in decline. Home ownership equals generational wealth. And the last thing is the education gap. Those three issues were there before the murder of George Floyd. 2 years later, they're still there.
Justin, I imagine looking back, you've got some thoughts as well?
Sure. I mean, one immediate thought I have is it's such a young population in that part of Capitol Hill, and how quickly the neighborhood changes and the people move on. And so it's a lot of that trauma that Omar is talking about for the residents of the area that lived above the violence and the protests and the police retaliation that went on and back and forth over the course of weeks. So many of them have chosen to move away,
Right.
but it's not a wasteland up there now. At the same time, and Capitol Hill is full of young
Right.
people, especially in its core, that have chosen to still
Yeah.
live there, and it's extremely vibrant. I guess the duty we have is to try and remember these things, and I know looking at the photos is difficult, but I make myself go back through my archives, and we've continued to report on the repercussions from this from a legal standpoint, from a government standpoint, and a social standpoint, and I'll never stop, really. It's probably going to be part of the story of Capitol Hill forever.
I would also say that, and it's in this room, that time of CHOP pointed out to me how important local media is. National media gets a lot of attention, but it was the local media that we really listened to and heard about, and it really drove home for me how important what y'all do is.
Absolutely.
So.